Our purpose at Reasons to Believe is to open people to the gospel by revealing God in science. For more than 3 decades, we've aimed to fulfill this purpose by encouraging and equipping people with God's truth through resources like books, blogs, videos, and podcasts. As our world changes and becomes increasingly tech-reliant, we are ready and willing to adapt to make Reasons to Believe more accessible than ever. We are thrilled to reintroduce the refreshed Ask RTB app. It's updated and ready for use when you're in need of a brief yet reliable answer to your science and faith questions. Backed by the expertise and research of our scholar team, the app is designed to be an easily accessible tool for you to explore science, faith questions, and answers. But you don't need a science degree to appreciate these answers. We did our best to address complicated questions with concise responses. The Q&A content is organized by topic and subtopics, creating an easy browsing experience. Video content so you can learn by watching or listening. Light and dark modes, font size, and spacing options support your reading preference. Each Q&A also features a Dig Deeper section so you can further your exploration at reasons.org. If you're new to Reasons to Believe, this is where you want to start. If you've been wanting to share RTB with a friend, this is the resource to share with them. With any technology, there will always remain work to be done, and there will always be new questions to answer. So your questions, if not already answered in the app, will be tracked and considered for future content. As you engage with the app, know that your curiosity fuels our scholars' ability to address the questions you, and likely others, are thinking about. We couldn't grow Ask RTB without you. You are truly building this with us. Explore the truth of Scripture as you learn how scientific discoveries reveal the God of the Bible. Bring your questions. Grow your faith. Download the Ask RTB app in the Apple Store or Google Play today.
Hello and welcome to Stars, Cells, and God, the show where we discuss new discoveries taking place at the frontiers of science that have theological and philosophical implications, as well as new discoveries that point to the reality of God's existence. My name's Jeff Zweerink, and I'll be your guide today as we explore topics of abstract objects and quantum mechanics. But before we get into that discussion, I want to encourage you to subscribe to our channel, Reasons to Believe. Click on the bell icon so that you can be informed of new videos. Learn more about us at reasons.org or go follow us on social media at RTB_official. Brian, I'm glad to have you here today. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about who you are and what you find fascinating?
Okay. Well, I am from Statesboro, Georgia, and married for almost 20 years. I have 3 kids.
Nice.
I got interested in apologetics and philosophy back in about 2004. Master's degrees in those areas, philosophy, biblical studies. I'm a chaplain in the Air Force.
Oh, very good. That sounds cool.
Yeah. I went and got a state SES and got a PhD in philosophy of religion. I've been at 4 churches on church staffs in various capacities. So I'm just all over the place, I guess.
Yeah, a little bit of an interesting and eventful life there.
Yeah, it's been fun. It's been fun.
Well, that's good to hear. So I'm excited to have our conversation today because I know you're talking about abstract objects and what are they and do they impinge on God, that sort of thing. So why don't I just give you the floor, kind of tell us what you're interested in, what you want to talk about.
Okay. So, in being asked to talk about things that are newish or new discoveries in this area, I thought about it and I thought, well, philosophers are still debating about things from 2,000 years ago. So I was like, okay. But things that would relate both to math, actually, as well as theology would be these things that philosophers now call abstract objects that go back really at least to Plato. And he tried to make sense of, well, how can this microphone color be black and that camera stand be black and this tablecloth be black? They all have blackness to them. So how can we explain that? How can we explain the notion of justice, where we have various acts of justice, or is there something that makes them all the same? How can you and I both be humans, but we're different beings? And so Plato devised what he called the forms or ideas, and that is that there is some kind of ontologically really existing form out there, not really in the material world, but out there in its own realm or existence that says, okay, everything that's black has a relationship to the form of blackness. Everything that's round, everything that's human, everything that's furry, anything. And so he devised this, and it's interesting because...
I have a question for you.
Sure, go ahead.
Would Plato have been looking at things in terms of there's this material world and there's something beyond, or is that kind of a more modern way of looking at it?
No, that's right.
Reimposing.
So the forms wouldn't be material.
Okay.
They are eternal, and that they weren't created really. They don't change. They're perfect. They're the perfect archetypal structure for things. So everything circular like this pop filter here or the top of the microphone would be an imperfect copy of the perfect form. So for Plato, for example, art was awful because the table being round is one step farther from the actual really existing circular form, or form of circularity. So if we made, take you and I, if we made a portrait of ourselves, that portrait would be a copy of us, so it would be a copy of a copy.
Okay.
So that he didn't like that kind of stuff. So yeah, these were immaterial, eternal forms that in some way or another, and there's all kinds of debate about how they relate to things, but in some way they relate to things, whether they're reflections, copies, participations in the form somehow.
All right.
And that would be with anything, beauty, even math, numbers. So 4 exists, red exists somewhere. So the question arises as to, well, if those things really are there, and philosophers are all over the place with these things, how do they relate to God? Now, the God question for Plato is very complicated, and he didn't write in a narrative. He didn't write in a kind of a dissertational way. He wrote in more conversational pieces. So it's hard to really nail him down on what he thought on things.
All right.
But the question is, supposing those things do exist, how do they relate to God? Because God is supposed to be the only being who is necessary, eternal. He doesn't exist because of anything else. He's ase, or he has what's called divine aseity, and that means that God is independent of all things besides himself, and he accounts for everything else that exists. Well, how can you account for something else that exists if it also is eternal and necessary?
So if you had a form of roundness or redness or whatever, presumably this has some aspect of that aseity that God would have.
It would seem like
that would be the idea.
Yeah,
there.
it would seem like, well, how do you account for, and even propositions would fit this nowadays, because we had a whole linguistic shift in philosophy back in the early 1900s, and a lot of philosophers tried to reduce philosophy to language. So propositions sometimes count as these abstract objects like murder is wrong or 2 + 2 = 4. So these would be said to be necessary and eternal. Well, how can they be necessary and eternal apart from God? So the question is how do these things relate to God? And there's different views on that. So you have Platonic theologians or philosophers who took these forms as they were with Plato, and quote unquote Augustine put them in the mind of God, and they're considered divine ideas.
Okay.
So this notion of divine ideas ran through a lot of medieval theology and philosophy, and still do. A lot of philosophers today and theologians still hold to the notion of divine ideas. So there are these form-like things that do sort of exist, but not really apart from God, but they're somehow grounded in God's own mind. In the sense that, well, I know God knows he can create X, Y, and Z, so those X, Y, and Z then are a divine idea of what he could do. Okay. And some philosophers just don't hold to these Platonic forms at all, or these abstract objects at all. So if you hold to them in some way, in a realist sense, you're a realist in that regard. The opposite pole to that is nominalism, which says that these universals, these abstract things really don't exist on their own. All that exists are things that I can point to. So these things exist in name only, nominalism for name. So black only exists in black things and so forth.
So what's running through my mind is, you talked about, murder is wrong. That would classify as one of these forms. So how would the nominalist account for that? Because there is no, outside of making a statement, murder is wrong, there is nothing you can point to and say, oh, that's what it means.
Yeah. This is where it gets a little bit dicey and tricky with nominalism. So A nominalist is going to say that all we have are individual things, and there's different forms of nominalism. You have class nominalism, resemblance nominalism, so it just gets as fun as you want it to be.
Right.
So they would maybe cash this out differently among their own particular strand, but they're going to say ultimately all that exists are particulars. There are no universals, not even in the mind. So people who would think that universals exist in the mind, like I can have the idea of blackness or circularity or whatever, would be more considered a conceptualist.
Okay.
So people who think that only individuals exist, I think, have a hard time explaining aspects of reality, because I do think that the universals exist, at least in the mind. But the nominalists also will deny that there are natures. So the question is, do you and I share a human nature? Well, a nominalist is going to say no. There's two humans, but there's not a nature that they share. Like
Interesting.
that.
Okay.
So whereas a realist would say there is something that we share in common regarding a human nature, and then a conceptualist would say, yeah, we can talk about a universal in the mind, but it's not really an essence in the thing.
Okay, so you got the
itself.
realist, the nominalist, and the conceptualist. Those are those
They're
roughly
not
exhaustive?
Those are kind of probably the top three, I would say.
Great,
Because
okay,
you've
all
got the universals exist extramentally. And that would be a form of extreme realism or Platonic realism. Then you've got a moderate realist position, which is what I hold to, which is that, yeah, these universals do exist and there are essences, but the essences are in the things. The forms are, quote unquote, in the thing, like Aristotle would hold to. He was Plato's student, and rejected the heavenly forms and said that, well, they're not transcendent, they're immanent in us.
Okay.
And so that would be a more moderate realist position where we think that there is an essence to, say, humanity, and there is a universal, a little bit different from Plato. Aristotle to Thomas Aquinas was more my position, which is there is a universal that exists in the mind as an abstraction of things, and then the nominalist says there's not even a universal or an essence. Then the conceptualist would say there is a universal, but it's only in the mind. There's nothing that we share in common in that regard. So there's different levels, different forms, that's a bad word to use here. There's different aspects of each theory, really.
Right. No, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, you get into, even in physics, you think, okay, there's this discipline, and then there's different ways to think about it. So that's not surprising. I guess one of the questions I have, and this isn't going at the how does that interact with God part directly, but, there's kind of one of the snarky comments that I thought was creative in the way it said, and then as I thought about it, I'm like, what does that mean? It's, there are people say, okay, you've got your God that tells you how to do right or wrong. Well, I just know how to not murder. I don't need a God to tell me that.
Okay, right.
But it seems to weigh in on these. It's like, okay, what does that mean? If I just know that that murder is wrong, how do we just know that? Because that does seem to hit on this. Is murder actually wrong? Is it something we've just decided was wrong,
right.
Or is there's how is interacting with this abstract
so
form
again,
type
back
thing?
to Plato, because as Whitehead said, everything just a footnote on Plato after him. He says, well, in his milieu, how we have polytheism, is murder wrong because the gods say it's wrong, or is it wrong because in and of itself is wrong? It is kind of reckoned. This became known as the Euthyphro dilemma.
Okay.
Well, basically, today there's different views. There's divine command theory in ethics and moral philosophy. There's natural law theory. So to answer your question, my view, to kind of put it more in perspective, the issue is, does God just kind of do this by fiat?
Right.
Can he say that murder is now okay, and that any heinous thing is now okay?
Right.
So the
so
problem,
this goes to Euthyphro's dilemma.
Right. So the question is God arbitrary? Or is he subservient to something else out there? Kind of the same thing as these abstract objects.
Right.
Is there something about them that determines what God can and cannot determine to be good? So I think the good answer to this is to say that God didn't have to create, so he was arbitrary in that regard.
Okay.
Or free in that regard. But since he created human beings with a specific nature, such that certain actions promote our good and certain actions prohibit our good or cause harm and evil.
Right, okay.
So because we have the certain nature that we do, one person killing somebody else in cold blood or in some unjustified way would be considered murder. would be taking that person's life, which is an evil,
Right.
and that would be wrong, regardless of what someone says about it. So, for example, if a lion were to break in here and destroy us, we wouldn't normally say that the lion committed murder. He would have killed us, and that would be an evil, but it wouldn't be a moral evil on the part of the lion because of what he is. But if somebody came in and just started killing us, then that would be murder because of the kind of being that is doing an irrational moral agent.
Okay.
So our moral fabric is based in and intertwined with the kinds of beings that we are. Likewise, if we just went out and shot a deer, that's not seen as murder because of the kind of thing that deer is. So that moral nature is really grounded in the kind of being that we are that God decided to create.
That's interesting because I look at how it seems where we're thinking about things, and there does seem to be this, general consensus, okay, murder is wrong, but there is kind of moving towards when you kill an animal that I don't know how many people would say that's murder, but it kind of has that flavor to it in the way we're talking about it in our society.
Yeah, and depending
today.
on your worldview, so for example, if you hold more to a pantheistic worldview where everything's equal, whereas the environment has equal footing as humans, animals do, then people might see that. In terms of you kill an animal, in fact, I was on a podcast once with someone who held this view, where if you kill an animal, that actually is murder, or if an animal kills another animal, that's also murder.
It's just interesting because that's one of these areas, and I've tried to figure out how to articulate this in a different project I'm working on. But there are these things that we seem to get. Well, duh, of course that's right. I mean, murder, of course that's wrong.
Right.
Or child abuse, of course that's wrong. And it's so prevalent of a thought in our society that it seems self-evident, if you will.
Right.
But ultimately, the reason why, or in our society, why it's wrong, it's got its predicate or its foundation in the Judeo-Christian worldview.
Yeah.
And so people have adopted that. Of course that's right, but they don't understand the grounding of it. And as you look back through history, child abuse wasn't seen as such a obviously type wrong thing. I mean, you could, even in the Roman times, you could, well, okay, we don't want this child. You just leave them outside the door. Things that we would see as abhorrent were accepted common practice. And so how do you help people, or how do we encourage people to see that not only the self-obvious nature, if you will, but the grounding of it is important, because we live in this society that's grounded on Judeo-Christian values.
Right.
We're moving away from that, but you kind of ask the question, okay, so where's that going to lead?
Yeah. I guess the grounding issue for somebody who holds to the view that I hold to would be that humans have intrinsic self-worth. And so we're going to have to explain that, as we want to maintain worth in the environment or in animals, and that's fine, that humans are radically different kinds of beings, not only by degree, which is what evolutionists might say, but also by kind.
Okay.
Or they differ not just by degree, but just by what they are, the kind of thing that they just are. So we have to, first of all, I think, not class humans alongside other things in the animal kingdom or plant kingdom or anything else around us, but recognize that there's something uniquely different about humans. And I think that most people around the world, there are obviously objections or exceptions to this, but I think as a general rule, people have a basic sense of morality in terms of, well, it's never right just to go around killing people. I mean, that has happened. I mean, look at the Holocaust.
Right.
Look at different things. But we recognize that is a moral, outrageous thing to do. So I think we need to be careful as Christians to maintain the objectivity of truth, objectivity of morality, and what we happen to be as a kind of being that we are. Is that getting at an answer to your question?
It really does.
Okay.
I mean, yes, it does. And I think that's critically important. I think my question was more motivated to where you run into people who, whether they have a naturalist worldview, and they say, well, of course I know murder's wrong. And I don't grant, I grant that, yes, they recognize that. My question is, in a worldview, a naturalist worldview, which doesn't have a form or a objective,
any kind of nature,
anything that would say, yes, murder is wrong, To me, that seems like there's a disconnect between what your worldview is saying and what you're saying. And I agree with what you're saying, but your worldview doesn't ground it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
In a place where Judeo-Christian the worldview has been the foundation of a lot of things, that works at some level.
Right.
If you just now go and say, all right, let's adopt a naturalist worldview, the idea that murder is wrong is eventually going to conflict with something else that impacts you more directly, and murder becomes okay. How do we have that discussion? Because it seems hard to get past the, well, duh, murder's wrong.
Yeah.
But that's ultimately Christian capital.
Yeah. So most of the time, at least the majority of the time that I've seen it, even naturalists want to maintain there is something about morality that even if it's just evolutionary based and it's utilitarian or egoistic or something, that there's something about what we are where I don't want to go around killing people or destroying people or hurting people.
Yeah.
There are exceptions to that. I've actually had conversations where someone says, yeah, rape isn't really wrong and murdering that person isn't wrong. It's just what our culture has kind of defined it in their own sorts of parameters. So that's scary.
Seems a little more consistent, though.
It's consistent with their worldview.
Yeah.
It's scary. Aristotle would say these kind of people, you either get it or you don't. So Aristotle was a naturalist himself, and he would say you either understand morality or you don't. You really can't teach it.
Interesting.
So that's why we have laws. That's why we have laws. So if you break that, you're hopefully going to jail.
Okay.
And we want to keep that person in jail, not letting them get back out and repeating the same thing over and over again. So some people are just not going to get it.
Interesting.
I agree with Aristotle. People have psychological problems or willful problems, and they may not want to follow the rules, as it were. But in terms of just the ideology behind it, we need to point out that, yeah, you may think that murder is wrong, and I'm glad that you do, but you don't have a really good reason for it, given this naturalistic. Apart from just we all want to get along so we don't destroy ourselves, kind of thing.
Yeah, I just this discussion of these things that we take to be universal and how do you explain their universal nature is really, I think, an important discussion to have. So I appreciate what you're bringing here. So, how do you end up getting universal statements that don't end up impinging on God's aseity, if you will?
So in the view that I hold, we want to say that 2 + 2 = 4 or murder is wrong or something like that. We would deny this extreme or ultra-realism of Plato.
Okay.
So we don't have these things that are self-existing out there in the form land or wherever you want to put them. And we would say that, yeah, murder is wrong when you have humans, or that statement is wrong given the divine ideas of what humans are. But without humans, there is no murder.
Okay.
So once we have humans, we can say, well, now we have these beings, humans, then one of them murdering someone else is wrong.
Okay.
So we abstract that kind of notion from our experience of things. Now, someone can say, well, is it always the case that murder is wrong? Well, if there's no humans, there's not going to be murder. I guess you could say, well, if there were humans, would murder be wrong? Yes, based on, again, the assumed existence of the humans.
Okay.
But if there's no humans, there's by definition not really any kind of murder going on.
So there's... How does that have the universality then? Because it seems almost conditional on something else, if you will. Or is that what you're saying, is that the idea of murder is wrong is conditional on there being humans who can actually do something like that?
That's one take on it, is that these kinds of universals, whatever that happens to be, whether it's blackness or even with numbers, the whole debate about are numbers real and whatever. So I would take, for example, numbers to be something that we have in our minds that we can kind of abstract. So I have one microphone. Well, I can take that one into the microphone, multiply it, have all kind of operations in my mind about that. So when it comes to things like universality of the nature of murder, the universality is applicable to the individual referent we're talking about. So murder would be wrong against humans.
Okay.
So you could say murdering a human being is always wrong.
All right.
Yeah, and that is always wrong. But if you have no humans, then the question is, what are you talking about? It's kind of like in linguistics, the question is this statement true or false? The king of France is bald. Well, there is no king of France in that kind of regard that we normally think of one. So it's not really true or false. It's just a statement that has no referent.
Okay. So it does acknowledge kind of the universality of the statement,
based
but
in the nature of the referent. Yeah.
It doesn't anchor it in some sort of self-existent
it's
idea
not existing,
that's out
right?
there.
It's not anchored in an abstract object because all those things are ultimately going to be based on God's creative act. and ultimately the divine ideas about what God can and cannot create.
So it does have it has the similarity to the Platonic forms in that there are things out there that transcend the material, physical stuff that we have, but those are not self-existent in and of their own entities. They're actually part of the mind of God.
If you take
will.
this kind of Neoplatonic view that Augustine held to, and it was traced all the way through the Middle Ages and even till now, that we have this kind of universal notion of humanity and the divine idea. We also can abstract that from each other. So like we can have inductive experiences of each other and say, okay, I know the nature of all these humans because I know what they're like in my mind through my epistemological framework. Can abstract the universality that we all have in common by leaving the individualistic matter behind.
Okay. Is that induction somewhat limited by the extent to which you've seen?
Yeah, so the more you have experience, the stronger the understanding becomes, to put it in that regard.
So there may be this form that flows out of God's mind that we can increasingly approximate the more we see it, in some sense, if you will.
Some may say
approximate our understanding of, I guess that's what I mean. So
some may say that. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Well, it's just an interesting idea because we live in this thing where it's like, as scientists think, we think most of them, I would say, we're actually figuring out how the world actually works.
Right.
That there's an objectivity about that, or it doesn't matter what you think, it matters how the world behaves, if you will. That's kind of seems to me a fundamental premise of science.
Exactly, yeah.
Unless you're just saying I'm playing a fun game. And I've known scientists who take that approach. But now you've got the question, okay, so what does it mean for something to be real or true, if you will? And I think that's an interesting discussion. Any final comments on that? Because that's a kind of a good transition to this. Some things I've thought about with quantum mechanics that are related to that.
Oh, sure, yeah, no, go for it.
And quantum mechanics is this weird. I struggle for terms with it because I don't want to use the terms because these terms have specific meanings, but it's incredibly accurate in that if you say, all right, here's my mathematical equations that go along with quantum mechanics, and I do the calculations and say, if I'm going to do this experiment, what result am I going to get? And I do the calculations carefully and precisely, and I come out and I get a number, and then I go out and make those measurements. Those two line up incredibly well, which is it's phenomenal. But there is this fundamental nature of quantum mechanics that is just so counter to the way you and I think. Because, I've got a pen here. I can put the pen down on the table. That pen, we're not looking at it, is still there.
Right.
And that pen is in that state, that it's got an objectiveness, a concreteness, a reality to it. And the only way to influence that pen is if things that are within its local light cone or its past light cone there are only certain things that can affect it, and it has this objective nature to it, if you will.
Yeah.
Now we start playing around with quantum mechanics, and we talk about light. Now we can talk about light as a photon. I work with photons because I work with X-rays and gamma rays, and when I'm doing that, they are particles, if you will. Okay. So it comes in and it gives a signature in my detector. Ooh, there was a gamma ray. That's the language I use of it. Hugh Ross, my colleague, worked with radio waves. There, you're detecting this wave. It's this not a particle of light. It's this wave that comes out of light. Okay. And what's fascinating is there's some experiments you see light as a wave. Some experiments you see light as a particle, and you ask the question, how can that be? You almost have these two different natures, if you will. And it's even far more fascinating than that, in that not just light, because light, okay, that's a little ethereal, weird, but the electrons that we're made of, or the neutrons. Okay. We can do experiments where we say, all right, let's take a beam of electrons and make it so that there's only one electron coming out at a time. And I put two slits out there. Now, if light goes through two slits, it will become, basically emanate a wave out there, and you'll get this interference pattern. And if you throw electrons through this double slit, one at a time, do nothing else, and then you put a detector on the background and say, all right, let's accumulate enough and see what sort of pattern we get, you're going to get the exact same interference pattern. So electrons have this wave property, but we think, okay, an electron, that's a particle.
Right.
So it's either going to go through this slit or through that slit, and so we should expect to see it in this line or this line. But when we just throw one through, it has this wave property to it.
That's fascinating, yeah.
And even more so if we now say, all right, let's be a little creative. Can we measure which one it went through? Because then we'll say, all right, the moment you measure it, the interference pattern goes away.
Okay.
And so what it's getting at is there is this seemingly contradictory way of looking at things where things that we take for granted macroscopically, that this pin is actually there, that it exists whether we're looking at it, and that it's only affected by the things in its past light cone. Something of that has got to give when we're dealing with quantum mechanics. And so, as it plays out in quantum mechanics, when you do calculations on this thing called the wave function. Now, to kind of simplify, let's just say you're dealing with something that can either be up or down. In every experiment we measure, we see that it's either up or down.
Okay.
That's the measurement we make is always that way. But the wave function, to properly describe it, it's actually in a superposition of up and down. You can't say it's either up or down. You actually have to have a term for down, you have to have a term for up, and you have to have a term for the mix of up and down.
Okay.
And if you don't, you just get it wrong. But yet we only measure it in either up or down. So there's this question of, is the wave function what's real or something else?
Right.
And because the wave function has this aspect that doesn't behave the way we do over here in our measurements.
Right. Now, I don't know a lot about quantum mechanics or theories, but what I have heard is people trying to use stuff like this to try to argue that all of reality is in flux, there's nothing really objective about it, and everything is relative. So I'm guessing that's not exactly the case. But
no, so this is the question. I mean, even that is there is some truth in what is being said there, in that you get down on small enough scales, and that really is the case, that what we measure or what we see or the nature of reality may depend on how we're observing it.
Okay.
But we also have experiments that say, no, that pen is there. I can measure it.
Right.
So that's one of the big questions, is how do you get from this microscopic quantum scale
to the macro
uncertainty to this we see things as there all the time.
Okay.
And what I find interesting in this discussion is that it just kind of raises the question, what is reality? What's really true?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And, I've just been fascinated because one of the ways you can do these calculations of the electron going through and getting the interference pattern is you say, all right, to do the calculations of this, let's assume or do the calculation for the electron having gone every single trajectory. And when you do the calculations and add them up, you get the right answer. Now, in quantum mechanics, you can say, all right, that's the calculation I did. What's the reality behind that? And some will say, oh, that means that every possible world exists.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
so this is kind of the many worlds interpretation,
right.
Which, again, just a little bit of background, things that I find fascinating about quantum mechanics is that when you talk about general relativity, nobody talks about, well, here's my formulation of general relativity, or here's my interpretation of general relativity. Because in general relativity, space is this dynamic substance of some sort. The presence of matter or energy warps the fabric of space. The mechanism and the calculations are tied up together.
Okay. Yep.
In quantum mechanics, it could be that the wave function is real and that it collapses, or it could be the many worlds, or. You go look on the Wikipedia page, and with all the caveats about Wikipedia, but there's this cool diagram that shows here's all the different interpretations of quantum mechanics, which people are wrestling with. We make measurements, and it's always one or the other. Our calculations are done on these things where it's a superposition. What's the nature of reality?
Have you encountered anybody? This is a weird question. I am a philosopher, so I get to ask weird questions.
Great.
So we had a philosopher of physics come and speak at our school a number of years ago. And he wanted to say that given the nature of quantum reality, because things can share the same space, then therefore they're not really physical. His response to that was that there's nothing physical because everything is built of these things that can share the same space, these photons and things. Do you run into that a lot? It's called idealism in philosophy, where everything's just an idea or immaterial, where it's just things in our mind. That's a bizarre view. It's not probably a standard view, but have you run into that in your?
I haven't a lot, and I would say probably a lot of these discussions tend to be in people who are very familiar with quantum mechanics because I'm a physicist. Right. I've interacted with quantum mechanics on and off in various ways for 30 plus years now. And I still don't have a real good understanding of it. And so to really be able to explore that requires more knowledge than I have. And so probably there's just a relatively small group of people that could actually interact with that in a credible way.
Right. Okay.
As your statement about, nature is who knows what based on, that's the sort of thing you get by people who don't understand and can't interact with it credibly.
Gotcha.
And so even in my discussion here today, I've just trying to make sure I say things credibly is hard.
Yeah, it is hard.
Because it's so counter to the way we think about things.
Right. Is that a typical way of thinking about matter, where you have these kind of particles that if they can share the same space like a photon or whatever these things are, that therefore they're not material? Or is that I've been told that's not a very traditional view of matter. That is not,
I've always thought in my interaction working and most of the people I've talked to, I've not run across many who think, matter isn't really there, that it's not a real physical substance. In fact, that is part of a property. There are two different kinds of matter you have. One that you can't put into the same space as another one of the same kind, and another one that you can.
Oh, okay.
And that's why you get, the Pauli exclusion principle. If you had any chemistry, you dealt with that because you can't put two electrons in the same space.
Okay.
Whereas you've got these weird things like Bose-Einstein condensates, which people have gotten the Nobel Prize for in recent times, where bosons you can put in the same state. So they just behave differently.
All right. Okay.
So I've never heard, can't say I've never heard that. I haven't interacted or run across that sort of idea much amongst physicists. So
I don't think it was a very common one.
It probably isn't. Again, just because most physicists tend to look at things, at least people who have been trained over the last 30 years or more, like I have, that there's a objective material world. We're trying to figure out how that objective material world operates. Okay. So, but in this discussion, so you got this weird nature of quantum mechanics and where things can look differently depending on how you observe them. One of the things that you can show is that you one of two things doesn't get to work. You either the thing when you're not looking at it isn't in a definite state. It's not real, if you will. There's not. You have to give up realism, or at least local realism, and that, just like any good philosophical discussion, you have to be really careful how you define that.
Exactly,
but I'm being a little bit casual in my terminology here.
Yeah.
Either if you're not looking at it, it's not there type thing.
Okay.
Or you have to give up causality in a different way, that the only thing that can affect that are things where light has been able to travel to it. And so people have been asking this question, and it's related to a paradox that was raised by, it's the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paradox, where you can take photons and you say, all right, let's take these two photons or two particles, make them interact together so that they now share a state, have them move apart. And if I measure this particle over here, I can measure either the position or the momentum. I can do either one of those. I can't do both at the same time. But because they're entangled, what I've measured here now tells me what the state of this one is over here.
Yeah, I've heard that one before.
And I could measure either the position or the momentum, which now raises the question, if I have a choice of which one I'm going to make, this over here has to have both of them well defined if those are real properties or not. And so this is, are there hidden variables? Is quantum mechanics complete? There's a whole fascinating discussion about that.
So I guess there's different interpretations of all this and what that means. People disagree, like philosophers do, and all this kind of stuff. Or is it pretty black and white?
No, it does, and that's why you've got these different interpretations of quantum mechanics. Some of them are locally real, other ones aren't. Some of them have locality, some don't. And so it's this There's general agreement. There's a lot of thought about what's important and what needs to happen. But at the end of the day, you've got this description of the fundamental reality, how you approach quantum mechanics or your interpretation of quantum mechanics can be there is some variability there, but they all give the same measurements.
Dumb question, I'm sure. Dumb question. But does this have anything to do with Schrodinger's cat, like how we observe the cat and what our effects on it by observing it, based on what you're saying with all this stuff? Is that wholly different?
No, it is just very much related to that. So the whole point of Schrodinger's cat experiment is there's a atom in there, that it either has decayed or it hasn't. And you can do that. How you get to that is one thing, but once it decays, it releases a poison. Once that poison is there, the cat dies. Well, quantum mechanically speaking, that atom, until it decays, is either it's in this mixture of up and down, or either decayed or not decayed. To properly describe that, we've got to use our wave function, and it's this superposition of decayed and not decayed. Well, macroscopically speaking, if it's decayed, the cat is dead. If it hasn't decayed, the cat is alive. So if it's in this mixture of up or down, so is the cat. Except that's the whole thing. We have some sort of aspect, once we get up onto the macro scale, things are well defined. On the micro scale, they aren't. And so it very much is related to this discussion.
Okay, well, good. As dumb as I thought it was.
No, it's a good question. And part of the challenge in doing this, or trying to understand this, is that when you're dealing with quantum systems, one of the challenges you have is that any sort of way you measure it dramatically tends to have pretty large consequences. So I want to measure the position of a particle very precisely. Well, to measure it precisely, I need to have photons with enough energy that allow me to probe those scales. Well, photons with that much energy, when they interact with the electron, scatter the electron. So by getting its position better, I have no idea what its momentum is afterwards. So this is, again, just the weirdness of quantum mechanics. But people are asking the question, are there things in quantum mechanics that allow you to get macro realism, related to this discussion, to get macro realism so that it still works even though you got the quantum? And so there's this kind of cool experiment. They were able to make some superconducting qubits, and I'm not going to go into what that is, but it's they were able to set up this experiment and test this inequality, or basically you say, okay, we can't do on an individual thing, so we've got to set up ensembles of things. But they were able to show basically that in this system with these superconducting qubits, that you get quantum influences of the scale of having, something that's equivalent to having 100,000 or 10,000 to 100,000 electrons lined up. So not just an electron, but a macroscopic quantity of electrons. So nanoamps over, I think they said 10 nanoseconds. So that's kind of macroscopic level quantities there. So it kind of says anything that says there's this macro realism at this level, it doesn't work.
Oh, okay.
And to me, and part of the discussion I want to have is when you as a philosopher understand that, okay, there's this fundamental nature where at the most basic level, or the smallest scale of this universe, when we're dealing with the quantum, that there seems to be this observer-dependent nature to reality. There seems to be something like that going on, that electron isn't just there,
right,
or its properties are not there until something has observed it. Whereas, macroscopically, that's not the case. But it seems like in the fundamental nature of our universe, there's this inherent observer-drivenness to it.
Right.
Part of me as a physicist, well, great, that's fine. Let's figure out what we can do with it. But it does raise the question, what is the nature of reality? We tend to think things are very objective, universal, whatever, but at the very nature of reality, it seems like there's this unreal or anti-realist view of things.
And that's kind of where I asked that question before, because I've heard people make these objections. Well, if by observing things, you necessarily change the behavior of what you're looking at. So if you look at Bart Ehrman's last page in his misquoting Jesus, he says he came to debate or discuss, I think it was a debate at our school years ago, and he applies this actually to reading a text. So if you read a book, you as the observer are actually changing the meaning of the text by virtue of reading it. Now the question is, well, how do you? The question that was asked by one of our professors, well, how do I know what your book says? Why write a book anyway if you can't read it? Which didn't go over very well with him. But people will take that kind of mentality that you just said about our observing something and how it changes it, and then apply it to all these kind of postmodern views of we can't know what reality really is. There's no objectivity and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and at least as a physicist, one of my responses, yes, it may be that's true when we're working down at the quantum level, and there may be bizarre instances where that shows up. But fundamentally, when I look at it, that pen, at least one way I can look at it is, yes, every electron and every atom in there has this observer-dependent nature to it. Mm-hmm. But I put enough of them together, and it gives me my observing no longer impacts the pen.
It's more stable.
It's like the ensemble averages out the uncertainties, if you will.
Okay.
So I can flip a coin, yes, heads or tails, who knows. I flip 1,000,000 coins, I can tell you very precisely exactly what it's going to look like. Okay. So that unknownness or that ambiguity or the chance or whatever you want to call it disappears in the ensemble. Okay. So at the macro world, we see things and we know what there is, but fundamentally that's not the way reality is.
Right.
And I guess the things that pop into my mind is we were having a discussion not too long ago about God is he in time, outside of time, and I tend to look at time as very fundamental, universal, if you will. But if I understand historically, Christians have thought of God as timeless.
Right.
And so my macroscopic experience and reality of the world is that time is fundamental. You get down at the quantum level and time is less clear there. And and maybe the ultimate reality is that there isn't time. The largest concept of reality is that there is no time. But there's this region where I am that time is now a constraint, not a reflection of the way things are. Is that philosophically a credible way of thinking, or is that just a physicist thinking weird thoughts?
Well, if you mean by ultimate reality, because I think in our discussion we said that God has created the spatio-material universe, which would include time, obviously, in the universe. So ultimately, and there's debates now. Historically, as you said, God has been seen to be timeless or eternal. And time is oftentimes defined differently in philosophy than it is in physics. So at least historically, for example, Aristotle defined time as a measurement of change.
Okay.
So the Earth goes around the sun what we now call a year. So that would there's not really time per se. There's just change going on, like an inch. There's no such thing as an inch in itself. There's an inch of something, but there's not an actual inch besides maybe the standard meter or something like that.
Right.
So yes, if you apply that to God as the ultimate being, and I understand that time kind of changes based on physically even within how things are moving and how all that plays out in the physical realm. So generally speaking, I think so. If you mean that broader picture to mean God. We have all kind of weird stuff with there. Like, how does angels then relate? Because angels aren't seen to be eternal like God, but not temporal either. They're kind of in this halfway house called eternity, and it gets really fun there.
Well, and to me, I mean, I think the discussion of how do you deal with quantum mechanics, I mean, that's something I'm trying to dig in and get a better understanding so that I can talk more than just say, well, there's a lot of different interpretations.
Sure.
But what does seem to be true, scripturally speaking, is that there is this created realm, and it is not the ultimate reality. It is a temporary one.
Right.
There's something bigger and more. And what that more is, I think we're always going to have physical bodies, and so there's some aspect to which we measure time and experience time.
Yeah.
But we're now looking at these things that we think are, this is the ultimate reality, and we realize, no, it's more complicated than that. Somebody asked the question, is this kind of a portal into seeing something beyond? And I think you got to be careful how you answer that. But the idea that what I take as the fundamental absolute reality, I have to be careful, because even in this world, I see that what I perceive day to day doesn't necessarily tell me what the ultimate reality is.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that seems to fit very comfortably in my theistic worldview.
Yeah.
And raises a lot of possibilities of, not just I can speculate wildly on what it could be, but given that there is this possibility, what do I see in this world that informs me about it, and what do I see in Scripture that would inform me about other plays?
So someone like me who doesn't know all the quantum stuff, but wants to learn more, not on a level that you do, because I'm not going to be a physicist, but what are some resources where I would go look and say, okay, I've read Hawking's The Grand, at least some of it. Are there any sources that can kind of not dumb that down, but make it where it's someone like me can actually get some of it? What are some sources of
that is a great question, and and I feel like that's what I'm trying to do.
Right.
We were having discussions about infinity, and I was worried, talking about that with philosophers. And what I've found in that is that there's a part of it. It's like find resources by credible people, and that's a little bit of a challenge.
Oh, really?
Because you look at something on the web, you don't know who they are. You got to evaluate find credible sources, but where you're gonna sample the diversity of thought out there, because I can go look at the article by these people and they have a certain picture of how quantum mechanics works. I can understand what they say. I can get it down and say, okay, yes, I understand. But that may not be representative of what the physics community thinks. And so you've got to get something that samples the distribution of that.
We have counterpoints books in theology. I've seen some in your own bookstore. Is there anything like that in your field where you have here's kind of like an anthology of the different views of how to interpret this, or is that not really out there?
There may be some of that. I am just kind of newly delving into quantum mechanics, and so I am not sure. I know some of the players out there and what their thoughts are. Honestly, the place I would start is just go look at a Wikipedia article, not because it's a authoritative source, but in general, I find where it describes science stuff, it does a pretty good job of describing the science,
good sources to go
and
to.
it gives you sources to go out and explore deeply on those things. So that would be lacking a more thorough bibliography. That's what I would accept for now.
Fair.
So, well, I've really appreciated our time, Brian. Thanks for your discussions about forms and abstract objects and stuff. And I want to thank you for joining us today on Stars, Cells, and God. I want to encourage you to join our discussion in the comments below. Remember to like this video and to subscribe for more content. We have new releases of Stars, Cells, and God each Wednesday. They're available here on YouTube and on your favorite podcast app. Remember to share this video with a friend. Go talk about it with them. And the more we know about science, the more we have reasons to believe.